Taiwanese Ghost Stories by Eon Nagu. I grew up in Taiwan and immigrated to the United States when I was 12 years old. Growing up there in the 80s and 90s, I still remember the old Taiwan before it became the modern country that it is today. The city development invaded into the tropic jungle that had once covered the island in its entirety. As the city grew, it swallowed up the old landscape that was originally rural and agricultural. I remember there were numerous, nameless, and unpaved back streets, old and abandoned farmhouses, overgrown pockets of vegetation, which served as shortcuts to school and playground after school. They also provided my friends and I endless backdrops and settings for scary stories that we made up to frighten each other. It is a common pastime back in those days that we gather around the adults after dinner listening to them telling the scary stories. Everyone had scary stories to tell, and they always claimed that the stories were real. Perhaps it is in the Chinese culture to frighten ourselves with stories of ghosts and spirits that we maintain a healthy respect for the unknown and unseen. Shinhai Tunnel. Shinhai Tunnel is one of the oldest tunnels that was built for the development of the Taipei city. It connects one of the nearby rural areas to the Taipei city for faster transportation. It was notorious for accidents due to the poor lighting and steep curves. A taxi driver picked up a young woman on the city side of the Shinhai Tunnel on a rainy midnight. She told the driver to take her through the tunnel and that her home is just 5 minutes away from the other side. The taxi driver turned on his meter and proceeded through the tunnel. The young woman sat in the back seat quietly. She did not respond when the taxi driver tried to strike up a conversation. She was also motionless the entire trip. The driver pulled up to an old house, and the young woman apologized to the driver that she had forgot her purse at work. She asked him to wait outside, and she will go get the money from her house. The taxi driver saw her go into the house. He waited and waited until 20 minutes had gone by. He grew impatient and went knocking on the door. An old man answered the door with a 100 new Taiwanese dollar, NTD, in his hand. The taxi driver was very mad and told the man that he now had wasted 20 minutes waiting outside. The old man stood there and let the driver finish his rant. The old man said, "I'm sorry, that was my daughter. She died 3 years ago in a car accident on the other side of the tunnel. Since the day of the incident, she comes home every night." Quanfu Elementary School. Quanfu literally translates to reclaim or liberate in English. It was the name of my elementary school in Taiwan. Such a patriotic theme was common back in the days when the Taiwanese sought legitimacy and international recognition separate from mainland China. Many schools and government buildings in Taiwan back then were old buildings constructed during the Japanese occupation of Taiwan from the 1890s to the 1940s. Quanfu Elementary School was one of them. The oldest building of the school was a 4-story tall circular building which was very unusual architecture for its time. Floors 2, 3, and 4 had a circular hallway around and were open in the middle so that one could look down to the first floor. There is a large circular skylight on the ceiling. No teacher would admit to it, but based on official government records, this building was used as a prison during the Japanese occupation, where prisoners were tortured and executed. Prisoners were hung from the 4th floor inside the building to serve as examples for the others. I remember that no students were ever allowed to go up to the 4th floor when I attended the school there. The story tells that some 6th graders, a few years ahead of my time, sneaked into the circular building one night on a dare. What seemed like a silly prank ended with one of the students falling over the ledge around the circular opening and died from his injuries. It was rumored that the students found the gate to the 4th floor and it was left unlocked, probably forgotten by the janitor. They climbed up the stairs to explore the 4th floor. The circular hallway was only lit by the moonlight coming through the skylight. All the rooms seemed very old. They peeked into the rooms through the windows and found that most of the rooms contained very old Japanese furniture, including desks, chairs, and filing cabinets. As they were leaving, one of the students saw something in a room and was startled. He pedaled backwards and tripped over the ledge around the circular opening. Confused and terrified, the rest of the students ran out of the building. One of them looked into the room as he ran past it. In it, he saw decapitated heads piled on the floor, and the bodies wearing clothes from the early 1900s. As he ran down the stairs, he could hear crying and people yelling in Japanese behind him. 13. Taiwan has a mandatory 2-year military service for young men when they turn 18. I personally did not have to serve since I was 12 when I left. Many of my friends, as well as members of my family, served in the military. My father served in the Taiwanese army in the 60s. During their days of service, most people are only allowed to visit home once a month. Imagine a bunch of 18-year-old young men, barely graduated from high school, get taken away from home and placed into bases located deep in the jungles or some tiny remote island off the coast. Homesick and terrified of the new surroundings, one can only imagine the fear these men faced on their first night watch at these remote outposts. My father told me of an incident that happened to his platoon. They were doing the training exercise Night March. It was an exercise in which the platoon had to march from one base to another in the cover of darkness within certain time limits. Failure to achieve this objective often led to revoking passes to the monthly visit home. At the time, my father's platoon was stationed in the bases located in Nantao County, part of the central mountain system of Taiwan, where a large part of the landscape is still covered by jungle. My father said that night march is one of the more dreaded exercises that they do. There had been many accidents associated with this exercise, such as the platoon getting separated and lost in the jungle, or the platoon leader not paying attention and leading the sleepy soldiers behind them off of a cliff. That night his platoon received the march order from the Central Command, a 20-kilometer march in full battle gear through the jungle after a whole day of training. The fog had came in and the visibility was very poor. The only light sources were their own personal flashlights, which were not allowed to be used without permission from the platoon leader. The whole platoon were exhausted, and they had 4 hours to complete the objective. As they were marching, people were losing their footing left and right. My father said some of his squad mates would practically sleep during their march. About halfway, the platoon leader gave the order to stop and allow the soldiers to rest for 10 minutes. My father was initially quite relieved for the much-needed break, but then he realized the platoon leader had stopped right next to an old abandoned burial ground. These unattended burial grounds were not uncommon during the 50s and 60s, when many poor farmers had no money for proper burials, and would leave the dead buried in shallow, unmarked, and sometimes uncovered graves. My father said that he could smell the rot in the cold, damp mountain air. He did not even dare to protest or warn his squad mates about their location when some of them started taking a piss near the shallow graves. His squad leader gave the order to sound off before starting the march again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There were only 12 people in his squad.
Which one of you idiots is too sleepy to count straight? Drop and give me 20.
Everyone in the squad groaned. My father said he was so furious at the squad mate who messed it up for everyone else. Whoever he was, he better hope that people couldn't figure out who he was. The thought of staying next to the burial ground and doing push-ups was just terrifying.
Sound off!
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
Not again! Who did this? Wake the fuck up!
Another 20 push-ups.
Sound off!
1,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. This is not funny anymore. Whoever it is, please stop. Another 20 push-ups ordered from the squad leader. By this time, my father's squad is the only squad that remained next to the shallow graves. Then he heard his squad leader. What the fuck? We're next to it. Let's get the hell out of here. He was relieved to hear that. By now, all of his squad mates had realized where they were, and everyone was freaked out. Everyone ran as fast as they could. To this day, my father could not tell if it was a prank from his squad mates or not. He played that voice who yelled 13 again and again in his mind. He said it didn't sound like any one of his squad mates. He was number 12, and he was certain no one was behind him. At least, he hoped so. It is busy out there tonight. My friend Eric, who served in the Taiwanese army in the 2000s, told me his story whilst he was stationed in a remote outpost in Taitung County. Eric was a smart guy, skinny bookworm type with glasses. He had already been accepted to college prior to being enlisted. To his surprise, military service was not bad at all for him. Since he had already been accepted into college, his platoon leader assigned him to light duties such as bookkeeping and other various office jobs. He was excused from most of the physical trainings. His bunkmate, a native Taiwanese from the nearby countryside, was some sort of prankster who claimed he could see ghosts and spirits. Eric said most people just laugh it off when his bunkmate reported the paranormal activities out in the woods during the night shifts. One night, Eric was on night watch duty from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. His bunkmate was the previous shift, and as they were switching off, his bunkmate said in a very serious tone, "It is busy out there tonight. Keep your eyes open." Eric was not amused by this. He almost wanted to introduce the butt of his rifle to his bunkmate's face. Grudgingly, Eric stepped out into the bitter cold and darkness. The entrance of the base is well lit. Nothing happened as Eric stood in the bitter cold for the first 2 hours. Eric said it was probably around 3 a.m. when he saw someone flip over the wall and run towards the officer's bunk. Startled, Eric moved cautiously towards the officer's bunk. It's not uncommon that some senior officer would sneak off the base to the nearby town for a drink or two. Eric did not want to cause any trouble that could be jeopardizing his cushy assignments. He found one of the officer bunk windows was lit. He peeked inside the window and found the officer awake sitting at his desk. The officer noticed him and called Eric to the window. Eric explained to the officer what he saw and that he was investigating if someone had sneaked into the base. Eric also told the officer that his bunkmate had been telling spooky stories, which was making him a bit more nervous than usual. The officer laughed and told Eric don't believe in that nonsense. Reassured, Eric returned to the post and switched off with the next night shift. The next morning, Eric went to look for the senior officer, wanting to thank him for his encouragement from the previous night. However, he was unable to find said officer. When he arrived at the officer's bunk, he found that the room that he was at last night had not been used for many years. Other people at the base told Eric it belonged to an old officer from China who had no family in Taiwan. He died in an accident 5 years ago, when he snuck out of the base to drink and returned drunk. The officer fell asleep behind a military truck and was accidentally ran over by the driver the next morning.